I'd never intended to spend the night in that cabin. It was supposed to be a quick, peaceful stop on my way back from a hike, but things don't always go as planned. I've always liked being outdoors, hiking and camping in the woods. It's my escape. So, when I found myself on a trail a little deeper in the forest than usual, I figured it would be a perfect spot to unwind before heading home. The trail was unfamiliar, but it wasn't my first time in the woods. I wasn't worried. The hike had been peaceful at first, but as the sun dipped below the trees, I realized I had been walking for longer than I'd planned. I tried to check the time on my phone, but the signal was weak. Not surprising. I'd been down this path before, and I knew the area could be patchy when it came to reception. I looked around and saw the cabin in the distance, partially hidden by the trees. It wasn't far, maybe 100 yards or so. It looked abandoned, like one of those cabins you see in movies, run down and lonely, but I was too tired to care. I figured I'd get a good night's rest and leave early in the morning. The door was slightly ajar when I approached, creaking in the wind. I hesitated for a moment but pushed it open anyway. The inside was dusty, but it looked safe enough. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a faint glow. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and the faint hint of something metallic. I stepped in, pushing the door shut behind me. The cabin had only one room, with a small kitchen area to one side and a rusty wood stove in the corner. There was a small table, 2 chairs, and an old couch that seemed to have seen better days. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. I set my bag down and immediately went to the window to check the time. The sun had almost fully set, and I knew I needed to start thinking about where I was going to sleep. I walked over to the stove and fiddled with it, eventually managing to get a small fire going. The heat felt nice against the cold that had already started creeping in. I grabbed a bottle of water from my bag and began to sit down when I noticed something strange. A large wooden chest sat in the corner of the room, its lid slightly open. I hadn't seen it when I first entered. Curiosity got the better of me and I walked over. The chest was old, worn out by years of use, but it wasn't locked. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking with age. Inside, there were a few blankets and what looked like an old jacket. But underneath them, there was something else. Something heavy. I reached in, my fingers brushing against something hard, cold. It was a gun, a rusty old revolver. I pulled it out, holding it carefully in my hands. The barrel was weathered, and the grip was covered in dust, but there was no denying what it was. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe it belonged to the previous owners, or maybe someone had stashed it there for another reason. I didn't want to think too much about it, so I set it back in the chest and closed the lid. The fire crackled in the stove, and I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had started to settle in my chest. It was getting darker outside, and the wind had picked up. The branches of the trees scraped against the windows, their shadows dancing across the walls. I grabbed a blanket from the chest, wrapped myself up, and tried to get some sleep on the couch. The fire was warm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the cabin. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. But every creak of the wood made me tense. Every gust of wind had me looking over my shoulder. I woke up to a loud bang. My heart raced and I shot upright, gasping for air. The cabin was silent again, but my mind couldn't let go of the sound. It had come from outside. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I peeked through the curtains, but all I could see was the darkness of the woods. I waited, listening. Nothing. I was probably just imagining things. But then I heard it again. A scraping sound, soft but unmistakable, coming from the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill run through me. Slowly, I turned the handle of the door, holding it firm. There was no one out there, but the moment I stepped out onto the porch, I saw something that froze me in place. A set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. I wasn't alone. Panic set in. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The closest town was miles away, and I wasn't sure I could make it back there in the dark. I grabbed my bag, pulled on my boots, and stepped back inside to lock the door. I knew I needed to leave, but before I could make it to the window to check outside again, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. I froze. The door rattled, then a knock. A slow, deliberate knock. It wasn't a frantic attempt to get inside. It was calm, almost patient. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just listened. The knock came again, but this time, there was something else. Something soft, like a whisper on the wind. It was distant, barely audible, but it sounded like a voice. "Help, please." I don't know how long I stood there, not knowing what to do. My body was frozen. My mind was racing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. The footsteps faded, and the silence returned. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold night. The footprints were still there, leading into the woods. But now they were not alone. I could see other tracks, smaller ones, scattered in the snow, all leading in the same direction. I didn't follow them. I didn't even look back. I just ran. The crunch of my boots in the snow was the only sound I could hear over the beating of my heart. I didn't stop until I reached the road. I didn't care how far I'd come or how dark it had gotten. I just kept running. When I finally got to a place with a signal, I called the authorities. When they got there, they found the cabin exactly as I'd left it. The door was locked. The footprints leading into the woods had disappeared. No sign of anyone. I don't know who knocked on that door or what the footprints meant, but I never went back to that cabin. I haven't gone back to those woods either. Some things are better left untouched, and I've learned that sometimes it's better to run than to ask questions. I'd never been one to enjoy the outdoors much. Sure, I went camping a few times when I was younger, but that was with a group of friends, and even then, the only part one looked forward to was the campfire and the stories we'd tell afterward. I never liked the silence of nature. It always felt too empty, too wide, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Still, when my friend Mark called me up one afternoon, insisting I join him for a weekend trip to a cabin he'd rented out in the middle of nowhere, I figured I might as well give it a shot. Maybe it'd be good to step out of my comfort zone, or at least that's what I told myself. The place was located somewhere deep in the woods, far from any nearby town. Mark said it was the perfect spot to unplug and relax, and the idea of getting away from the usual grind was appealing. When I pulled up to the cabin, my heart sank a little. The building looked old, older than I expected. It was made of weathered wood, the kind that always looks like it's about to rot. The windows were small and almost hidden behind thick curtains. There was a sense of neglect about the whole place, but Mark was already out front, waving excitedly. "Come on, man. This place is perfect," he shouted as he grabbed my bags and tossed them inside. He didn't seem to notice the worn-down appearance of the cabin, or maybe he didn't care. I stepped inside and immediately felt the temperature drop. It wasn't exactly cold, but there was a certain chill in the air, like the house itself was somehow frozen in time. The inside was dimly lit, even with the sunlight streaming through the small windows. The wood panels lining the walls were just as old as the exterior, some of them warped and creaking under the slightest touch. The place smelled like stale air and old furniture. "Got the fire going in the living room," Mark said, gesturing toward the stone fireplace. I could already see the soft flicker of orange light coming from the other room. "Looks cozy," I muttered, but I wasn't sure I meant it. There was something unsettling about the whole setup. like it was a movie set trying too hard to be charming. We spent the first few hours settling in. Mark started unpacking the cooler he'd brought, and I busied myself with exploring the place. It wasn't a big cabin, but it had enough rooms to make it feel like there was space to get lost in. The kitchen was small, with rusty old appliances that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The living room, though, was surprisingly warm, with a thick rug and plush couches around the fireplace. It gave off a comfortable vibe, but the more I looked at the place, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later that night, after a dinner of canned beans and grilled hot dogs, we sat by the fire. Mark had brought a couple of beers, and we settled into the silence that only comes when you're in the middle of nowhere. The crackling fire was the only sound, and even that felt like it was trying too hard to fill the emptiness. First, it was fine. Mark was talking about his latest work project, and I half listened while watching the flames dance. But then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A soft thud, a dull, hollow sound. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Mark was still rambling about his job, not noticing anything. I scanned the room, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. It was hard to tell because the cabin was so still, but it definitely hadn't been the wind. Thud, thud. It was coming from upstairs. I looked over at Mark. He was still deep in conversation, completely unaware of the noise. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I stayed quiet, but the sounds were growing louder, almost like footsteps, slow, deliberate steps. My heart began to race, and I stood up, excusing myself to go check it out. I didn't want to scare Mark, but something inside me told me I couldn't ignore it. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed to the second floor, each step echoing louder than the last. I reached the top and looked around the landing. There were 2 rooms, one on the left and one on the right. The hallway was dim, with only a small lamp providing any light. I stood still for a moment, listening. The noise had stopped. Maybe it was just the house settling. But then, I heard it again, this time louder, closer. Thud. The sound came from the room on the right. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I twisted it quietly, pushing the door open just a crack. Nothing. I pushed it open wider and stepped inside. The room was empty. It was a small bedroom with a single bed and a worn-out wooden dresser. The air felt cold here, colder than the rest of the cabin. There was something wrong about it. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I looked around one last time, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just old furniture, dust, and shadows. But as I turned to leave, I saw something. A small, faded picture frame sitting on the dresser. I hadn't noticed it before. I picked it up and stared at the photo. It was an old black and white image of a family standing in front of the cabin. The parents, a man and woman, both looked like they were in their mid-30s. There were 2 kids standing beside them, one boy and one girl. They were smiling, their faces full of life, but there was something about the image that felt wrong. The family looked almost too perfect, as if they were frozen in time, and their smiles didn't seem natural. They looked like they were posing, like they were waiting for someone to take the picture, but the look in their eyes was empty. I set the picture back down quickly and backed away from the dresser. Something about it made my skin crawl. When I returned downstairs, Mark was sitting by the fire, looking at his phone. I didn't bring up the noise or the picture. I didn't want to seem paranoid. We stayed up late that night, finishing the beers and talking about random things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't as empty as it seemed. There was a weight to the silence, a presence that lingered in the corners of the rooms, just out of sight. It wasn't until the next morning that things really started to unravel. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, far from anything resembling civilization. It wasn't exactly the cozy retreat I had envisioned when I decided to get away for a weekend, but it was quiet. Too quiet, in fact. I had driven up here alone, needing to clear my head. The stress of work, the constant noise of city life, it all had been suffocating. The idea of staying in a remote cabin sounded perfect. I had found it online, advertised as a rustic getaway, with a few pictures of a small wooden cabin and a view of a serene lake. The listing was vague, but it was cheap, and I liked the idea of disconnecting for a while. By the time I arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the treeline. The cabin looked older than the pictures had led me to believe. Peeling paint, broken shutters, and a wooden porch that seemed to sag under the weight of time. There was no driveway, just a narrow dirt path that led through the forest, and when I parked my car, the silence that hit me was absolute. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the trees, not even the distant hum of a highway or an airplane. Just stillness. I grabbed my bag from the back of my car and trudged up the porch steps. The door was unlocked, which was a good thing, I suppose. I didn't want to go through the hassle of trying to find a key. The inside was what you'd expect. Old furniture, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a kitchen that felt more like a museum exhibit than a place to cook. There was a faint smell of mildew in the air, but nothing too overwhelming. The place had character. I set my things down and decided to take a walk around. The cabin was surrounded by dense trees, the kind that felt like they were closing in on the building. The air was thick with moisture, and I could feel the dampness on my skin as I walked along the path that led to the lake. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. For a moment, I thought maybe I had made the right choice in coming here, but something didn't feel right. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a nagging sense, like a small voice in the back of my head whispering that I didn't belong here. The more I looked around, the more I realized that the forest felt wrong. The trees were too thick, too close together, as though they had been growing for centuries without any human interference. There was an unsettling silence in the air, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shook it off. It was probably just my nerves. I'd spent the last few months running on empty, and this was the first time in ages I had been alone with my thoughts. I needed rest, that's all. Maybe tomorrow I'd feel better. That night, I settled in by the fireplace with a book. The wood crackled and popped, but the warmth it gave off felt distant, somehow. The room was cold, and I found myself pulling a blanket tighter around my shoulders. It was late by the time I finished reading, and I could feel my eyes getting heavy. I blew out the candle on the table beside me and crawled into bed. The mattress was hard, but it was better than nothing. I should have been asleep within minutes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the cabin seemed too loud. Every whisper of wind through the trees felt too close. I lay there for hours, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't until I heard the distinct sound of footsteps on the porch that my heart truly started to race. Thud, thud, thud. Someone was on the porch. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy, and there was no sound of leaves crunching underfoot, as you would expect in the woods. Just the steady, rhythmic sound of boots on wood. I sat up in bed, frozen, listening. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, deeper and more suffocating than before. I waited, barely breathing. Then, a faint tapping came from the window, a soft, almost hesitant knock. My pulse quickened. I didn't move, not at first. The thought of getting up to look outside seemed insane, but something told me I had to. It wasn't curiosity that drove me, but something darker, something primal telling me I needed to know who or what was out there. I slid out of bed, my feet making no sound on the wooden floor. I crept toward the window, careful not to make a noise. My hand hovered over the curtain, my breath shallow in my chest. With a sudden rush of adrenaline, I pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The porch was empty. The moonlight bathed the steps in a pale glow, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding, and I found myself standing there, staring out into the night, waiting for something, anything to move. I closed the curtain, my thoughts swirling. Was I imagining things? Had I heard the sound wrong? It was possible, but I didn't think so. Something wasn't right. The air felt thick, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I decided to take another walk. Maybe the fresh air would clear my mind. I made coffee and walked down to the lake again. The water was still just like before, but there was something different about it. The surface wasn't as clear as it had been yesterday. The reflection of the trees seemed off. It was as though the lake was distorting the image, twisting it in a way that made me uneasy. I turned away from the lake and started walking deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, their thick trunks and low-hanging branches cutting off the sunlight. It felt like the forest was alive, watching me. I could hear the rustling of leaves, but there was no wind. It was as if the sound came from all directions, but not from anything specific. That's when I noticed it. Path. At first, it seemed like just another trail, worn into the earth by countless footsteps. But this path was different. It wasn't natural. It was too clean, too deliberate. I could see where it had been cut through the underbrush, where the trees had been trimmed to make room. My curiosity got the best of me. I followed the path, my heart hammering in my chest as I went deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser as I moved forward, their branches pressing in from either side. The air grew heavier, and the further I walked, the less I could hear. The silence around me felt suffocating. Eventually, the path ended in a small clearing. And there, in the center of the clearing, was an old shack. It was nothing like the cabin I was staying in. This shack was made of rough-hewn wood, the walls weathered and gray. There were no windows, only a small door that hung slightly ajar. The roof was sagging, and a few of the planks were missing, leaving gaps where I could see the blackness inside. I stood there, staring at the shack, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had no idea why I was drawn to it, but I couldn't look away. It was as though the shack itself was calling to me, beckoning me closer. I took a step forward, then another, and before I knew it, I was standing at the door. It creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sending a chill through my body. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. There was nothing but a single rusted metal chair in the center of the room, and the walls were covered in strange, faded symbols. My mind raced, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the symbols. They weren't anything I recognized, but they were familiar in a way I couldn't explain. The more I stared at them, the more I felt as though they were speaking to me, urging me to understand something I wasn't meant to. I stepped inside, my feet heavy as though the very earth beneath me was resisting my presence. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, my pulse skyrocketing. The door was locked. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped inside, with no way out. But then the floorboards creaked. Something was moving inside with me. I don't know what drew me to the cabin. Maybe it was the isolation, the promise of quiet, or maybe it was just the idea of getting away from everything for a while. My life had been a blur of work and responsibilities. Deadlines, bills, constant demands, and I had this overwhelming need to disconnect, to clear my head. So, when I saw the listing for the cabin deep in the woods, something inside me said, "This is it." The drive there was long and winding. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in, as if they were trying to keep me from leaving. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for one car, with potholes that made it feel like I was driving through a constant shaking. The air outside was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell I'd forgotten how much I liked. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin itself was a bit older than I expected. It wasn't the charming, rustic cabin you see in vacation brochures. It was rough around the edges, with chipped paint and creaky steps leading up to a small porch. But it had a certain kind of character to it. Despite its age, it felt like a place that had stood the test of time, weathered by seasons and storms. I unloaded my things and entered the cabin. The interior was simple, functional. A small living room with an old couch, a kitchen with the basics, and a wood-burning stove. There were no signs of recent use, just layers of dust that seemed to be a part of the cabin's history. The floors creaked as I moved around, and there was a faint smell of mildew that came from somewhere deep in the walls. But there was something comforting about it, too. It felt like a place that was waiting to be lived in again. I started a fire in the stove and made myself a quick dinner. As the night grew colder, I sank into the couch, watching the flames flicker and dance. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear every creak of the cabin settling, every gust of wind that rattled the windows. The silence was almost deafening, but in a way, it was exactly what I needed. No phone calls, no emails, just the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of the wind outside. But then there was a sound, a soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing for a moment, not knowing if I had imagined it. The knock came again, this time louder. I stood up, slowly walking toward the door. My mind was racing. Who could possibly be out here in the middle of nowhere? The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen another car for hours. I opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. Nothing but the cold, empty night. I stepped outside, looking around, but the clearing was empty. There were no signs of anyone. The knock had sounded real, though. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was watching me from the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe an animal had knocked something over, or the wind had made the noise. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting, but as the night wore on, the feeling didn't go away. I could still hear the occasional creak of the cabin, but there was something different about it now. It wasn't just the house settling. It felt like something was moving around inside. I sat up on the couch, my senses on high alert, straining to listen. But there was nothing. The sound had stopped, and the cabin was once again silent. I tried to brush it off. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. A soft knock. This time, it came from the back of the cabin. I walked over to the window and peered out into the darkness. The trees were still, the ground covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. There was no movement, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. A figure. It was standing just beyond the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I focused, I saw it clearly. A person just standing there watching the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I confront them? But what if they were dangerous? What if they were just as confused about me being here as I was about them? I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I thought about grabbing my phone and calling for help, but I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no signal out here. The cabin was so far off the grid that I couldn't even get a text through. I sat there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. I could hear my own breathing, my pulse pounding in my ears, and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just waiting. When morning finally came, the figure was gone. I stepped outside cautiously, looking around the clearing. The ground was untouched, no signs of footprints or any disturbance. It was like nothing had happened at all. I couldn't explain it. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just some trick of the light, or maybe there was some reasonable explanation. But that night, it happened again. Another knock. Another figure standing in the trees. Only this time, I wasn't alone in the cabin. I had invited a friend, someone I trusted, to join me, hoping the company would ease my mind. But now, even though there were two of us, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone else renting a cabin nearby, or maybe it was some local who lived in the woods. But deep down, we both knew that wasn't the case. The figure was too deliberate, too calculated. Felt like we were being stalked. The third night was the worst. We were sitting by the fire, trying to act normal, when the knock came again. This time, it was much louder, almost as if it was coming from inside the cabin. My friend and I exchanged nervous glances. We both stood up, both of us instinctively reaching for something, anything, nearby to defend ourselves. We heard a sound, soft at first, then louder. Something scraping against the outside of the cabin, like nails on wood. It was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Then the door to the cabin was yanked open. I don't know what we expected, but it wasn't this. Standing there was a man, dirty, disheveled, and wild-eyed. He was breathing heavily, his face twisted in a strange mix of fear and anger. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and bolted it. I backed away, heart racing. My friend was already on the phone, trying to get a signal, but the call wouldn't go through. The man was still out there, pacing around the cabin like a trapped animal, his eyes occasionally glancing in through the windows. For hours, we stayed inside, praying that he would go away. But he didn't. We could hear him outside, muttering to himself, scratching at the walls, pacing back and forth. It was clear he wasn't going to leave until he had what he wanted. We were trapped. The only option left was to leave the cabin. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but it was clear we weren't going to make it through the night without a confrontation. We made a run for it at dawn. As we reached the car, I glanced back at the cabin. The man was still there, standing in the doorway, just watching us. We left and we didn't look back. When we finally got to the nearest town, we told the authorities what happened. They assured us they'd investigate, but something about the way they reacted made me feel like they didn't believe us. Maybe it was just the remote nature of the cabin. Maybe it was just the way the town operated. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something much worse. Something that had been waiting for us in those woods. Something that had known we were coming long before we ever set foot in that cabin. We never went back. And to this day, I don't know who or what that man was. But I know one thing for sure. There are things in those woods, things that don't belong in this world. And some places are better left undisturbed. I didn't plan on it, not at all. But there I was, standing in front of a rundown cabin deep in the woods, the kind of place you only find if you've got no business being there. I hadn't been prepared for this. The trees around the cabin were thick, the branches heavy with old leaves. I could barely see the sky, just slivers of gray peeking through the canopy above. A chill ran through me, not from the cold but from the silence. The hike had been longer than I expected. I didn't really know what I was getting into when I decided to take the shortcut. Sure, there were warnings about the area, but I figured, how bad could it really be? It was just a few miles off the trail. A cabin, isolated but not abandoned, was supposed to be an interesting spot to stop for the night. But now that I was here, I wasn't so sure. The place didn't look abandoned at first glance, but it wasn't exactly welcoming either. The wood was weathered, the roof sagging in places. A stack of firewood lay to the side, but the pile seemed unused. I could hear the rustling of something in the woods behind me. Maybe an animal, maybe the wind. The air felt too still. I thought about turning back, but I was tired, and the thought of walking all the way back was more than I could bear. The sky above was darkening quickly, clouds gathering and blocking out the last of the sunlight. I needed to rest, and this cabin seemed like the only option. Besides, it wasn't like I had any other choice. I stepped forward, my boots crunching on the dry ground. I tried the door, which creaked as it swung open. Inside, the air was musty, stale. Dust hung thick in the air, and I had to blink a few times to clear my vision. The walls were lined with old wooden planks, their edges chipped and broken from years of neglect. There was a small window on one wall, but it was covered with grime and spider webs. I couldn't see anything outside through it. The main room was bare, save for a small, cast-iron stove in one corner, a rickety table, and a few mismatched chairs scattered around. The fireplace on the far wall was cold, its hearth empty. The place had a strange emptiness to it, like it had been untouched for years, yet something about it made me feel like I wasn't alone. I shrugged off the unease and went to the far corner, where there was a stack of old blankets. They weren't much, but they'd have to do for the night. I set up a small makeshift bed on the floor, trying to ignore the creaking of the wood beneath me. The whole place seemed to groan under its own weight, as if it was a living thing, constantly shifting and settling. As night fell, the woods outside seemed to grow darker, quieter. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, the kind of smell you get when things have been left to rot for too long. I tried to ignore it and focused on the warmth of the fire I managed to get going in the stove. The crackling of the flames was comforting, but the silence beyond the cabin felt too heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every now and then, I'd hear a rustling sound from outside, too distant to pinpoint, but close enough to make me uneasy. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, maybe even a bear. But then the noises came closer, and I stopped moving, holding my breath. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew it wasn't just the wind. I tried to ignore it, curling up under the blankets. Sleep was hard to come by. Every small noise made me flinch. The wind started to pick up, rattling the windows and making the walls groan even louder. A few times, I thought I heard footsteps, but when I looked outside, all I could see was the inky blackness of the woods. Around midnight, I heard something else, something more distinct than just rustling. A tapping at the window. It was soft at first, barely audible. But then it came again, harder. The noise was rhythmic, deliberate. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one out there. No way. The door was locked, and the only window that might have been close enough was covered in layers of dirt and grime. But still, the tapping continued, each sound more insistent than the last. I couldn't see anything through the window, just the dark outline of trees, shifting in the wind. I got up, slowly, my hands shaking as I grabbed a flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I shone it through the grimy glass, expecting to see nothing. But there, just beyond the edge of the beam, I saw it. A figure standing in the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape of someone. No, something tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the woods. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I stepped back, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or a shadow cast by a tree. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The tapping at the window came again, sharper this time. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, listening to the sounds outside. The wind howled, and the trees creaked. But there was something else now, something I couldn't ignore. I kept hearing small noises, as if someone or something was moving around the cabin, scraping along the walls. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed and my mind racing. I had to leave. I didn't care how far back to the trail I had to go. I just needed to get out of there. I packed up quickly, my hands moving mechanically, barely feeling anything as I went through the motions. The air inside the cabin was still thick with dust, and the silence was almost unbearable. I glanced at the window again, half expecting to see the figure standing there, but it was empty. I stepped outside into the morning light, the cold air hitting me hard. The woods were still quiet, too quiet, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to civilization. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small mark on the cabin's doorframe. I leaned in, wiping away some of the dirt. It was a series of scratches, deep grooves carved into the wood. They weren't random. They were deliberate, and they looked fresh. I froze, the blood draining from my face. Those scratches weren't from an animal. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it, I heard a sound behind me, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing there. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I grabbed my pack and started moving. Fast. I didn't look back, not even once, as I hiked back down the trail. The air felt different now, heavier, like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I made it back to the main road by late afternoon, and I kept walking, not stopping until I reached a small gas station. The clerk behind the counter looked at me like I'd seen a ghost when I stumbled in, pale and out of breath. "Are you all right?" she asked. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that whatever had been at the cabin, whatever was still out there, was still watching. I didn't tell her about the scratches or the tapping or the figure in the woods. What was the point? No one would believe me, but I knew the truth. There was something out there, something that wasn't human, and it wasn't done with me yet. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend away from everything. A friend of mine had mentioned this cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and I jumped at the chance. I needed to clear my head, take a break from work, and just be away from all the noise of city life. The idea of being completely alone, surrounded by trees, with no Wi-Fi, no distractions, just nature. It sounded perfect. The cabin was about 2 hours outside of town, tucked away in the woods. I had to drive down an old, gravel road to get there, and by the time I arrived, the sun was starting to dip low behind the trees. The air was crisp, the smell of pine thick in the air. Everything felt calm, peaceful, too peaceful, maybe. I parked my car in front of the cabin, a modest wooden structure with a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. It had the kind of charm you see in old movies. Rustic, simple, and untouched by time. The windows were large, offering a view of the surrounding forest, and the cabin was surrounded by trees, their trunks thick and dark against the fading light. I grabbed my bags, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The inside was cozy, exactly what you'd expect. A fireplace sat in the center of the living room, with a pile of firewood stacked neatly beside it. The floorboards creaked as I moved through the space, and the smell of wood and aged furniture filled the air. A small kitchen was tucked in the corner, with a fridge and an old gas stove. A little table sat in the middle of the room, a couple of chairs around it. There were 2 bedrooms, one with a queen-sized bed, the other with a set of bunk beds. I chose the queen-sized bed, wanting the privacy. The room had a window that overlooked the forest, which I thought was perfect. As the sun went down, I lit a fire in the fireplace, watching the flames crackle and dance. I cooked a simple dinner of pasta, feeling strangely alone, but in a good way. It was just what I needed. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It wasn't the cabin itself or the fact that I was alone. It was the silence. It was too quiet. I could hear the occasional rustle of branches outside, the wind picking up, but it felt as though the world had gone completely still. No animals, no insects. It was almost as if nature itself had decided to hold its breath. I brushed it off at first. The cabin was remote. Maybe that's why it felt so empty. But then I started noticing things. Small things at first, things I could explain away. A strange sound in the walls, maybe a rodent or something scratching, tapping. But it wasn't just that. Every now and then, I'd hear a low, almost imperceptible thud, like someone was walking just outside the door. I'd go check, but there was never anyone there. Just the trees, just the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't constant, but it would hit me at random moments like a shadow just over my shoulder, just beyond the reach of my sight. I convinced myself it was just the isolation getting to me, a trick of the mind. That night, after a long, restless stretch in bed, I finally decided to call it a night. I turned off the lamp beside the bed and lay there in the darkness, the only sound the crackling fire in the other room. My eyelids grew heavy, and I almost drifted off to sleep when I heard it again. A thud, this time louder, more deliberate, came from outside the cabin right next to the window. I froze. My heart started racing. I couldn't move. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The thud came again, and then I heard a scraping noise, like something was dragging against the wood of the porch. My mind went wild, running through possibilities. Was it an animal? A bear? Person? What would I even do if it was someone? I didn't have a weapon. I had no way of defending myself. I must have been lying there for an hour, listening to the noises outside, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal. But the scraping didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, almost as if whatever it was circling the cabin. I slowly slid out of bed, my bare feet pressing against the cold floor. I grabbed my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight without making too much noise. I stepped quietly toward the window, trying to peer through the blinds without being seen. The light from the fireplace flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. My fingers were trembling. I held my breath as I peeked through the blinds. There was nothing out there, just the dark, the trees, the empty porch. But that didn't make me feel any better. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, a gnawing sense of dread. I decided to call the friend who'd recommended the cabin. Maybe they knew something, maybe they could reassure me. But my phone didn't have a signal. The call wouldn't go through. I stepped out onto the porch, trying to calm myself, to convince myself everything was fine. But the moment I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dirt. I could see them clearly in the faint light from the cabin. They were large boots, the kind you'd expect someone to wear if they were hiking. But they weren't mine. They were leading up to the cabin and then nothing. The trail ended right at the edge of the porch. I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. My first instinct was to run, to jump in my car and drive back to town, but I couldn't. The car was parked in the opposite direction, and if someone was out there, I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I spent the next few hours pacing inside, moving from one window to another, peeking outside, watching, waiting. The sounds had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. It was as if the forest itself had come alive with secrets, and I was the only one who didn't know them. By morning, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I hadn't slept. The sun had risen, and for a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a bad dream, a product of too much isolation. But when I stepped outside, the footprints were still there. And this time, I noticed something else. There was a faint trail of blood, leading from the footprints, cutting through the dirt, as if someone had been injured and had stumbled away from the cabin. My heart was racing now. I knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things as quickly as I could, throwing them into my bag, my hands shaking. I checked the locks, double-checked everything. And then, I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. Took hours to get there. When I pulled up to the local diner, I was shaken, dirty, and terrified. I told the woman behind the counter everything that had happened. She listened quietly, her face hardening as I spoke. When I finished, she leaned in, her voice low. "You're not the first to come in here talking about that cabin," she said. "People disappear out there sometimes. It's a place to avoid. I never went back, and I never will. The feeling of being watched never left me, even when I was back in the city, surrounded by noise and people. I don't know what happened out there or who or what was following me, but whatever it was real, and I know it's still out there, waiting." The rain had been relentless for hours. The sound of it slamming against the roof, splattering on the windows, was the only thing that kept me company in the small cabin. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I came out here to escape, to find some peace. But now it felt like the storm had trapped me here, and there was no way out. I had rented this cabin online. It was supposed to be an isolated retreat, perfect for a solo getaway. A quiet place to think, to write, to breathe without the constant hum of city life. The pictures had looked nice. Wooden floors, large windows looking out into the wilderness, a cozy fireplace. I could already imagine myself curled up with a book by the fire. But as soon as I arrived, things felt off. The air was thick, as if something heavy had been hanging there for years. The road to get here was long, winding through dense forest that looked darker and more foreboding the deeper I went. The trees, tall and thick, had a way of blocking out the sun, making it feel like dusk even at noon. The cabin itself wasn't in bad shape, but there was something about it that didn't feel quite right. The door creaked when I opened it, the wood groaning under my weight, as if it hadn't been used in years. Inside, everything was old but functional. A worn-out couch sat in front of a stone fireplace, and the wooden beams above me seemed to stretch on forever. The windows were covered with thick curtains that I hadn't touched. Even now, I hadn't felt the need to open them. I just wanted to get settled and wait out the storm. That was the plan. Just wait it out. But that plan started to unravel when the wind picked up. I had no idea the storm was going to get this bad. The trees outside started to sway violently, their branches rattling against the window panes like they were trying to get inside. The rain, which had been gentle at first, became a torrential downpour, beating down against the glass with an almost frantic energy. I was sitting on the couch, my feet up on the coffee table, my laptop open in front of me. The internet had been spotty since I arrived, but I didn't mind. I come here to disconnect after all. The flickering of the screen was the only sign of life in the otherwise dim cabin. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the direction of the back door. The sound was sharp, unmistakable. Something had fallen. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting company, and I hadn't heard anyone approach. For a moment, I told myself it was just the storm. A tree branch, maybe, or debris getting thrown against the building. But the silence that followed the crash was unsettling. The rain, which had been roaring just moments ago, seemed to die down. And in that strange, eerie quiet, I heard something else. A low, dragging sound, almost like footsteps, but slow and deliberate. I felt my stomach tighten. I couldn't make sense of it. The cabin was supposed to be remote. No one should be here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I stayed frozen for a long moment, listening. The sound stopped, and then The storm started up again, as if it had never paused. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. It was an old building, after all. Maybe it was just the weather playing tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something was wrong. I tried to get back to my work, but the words wouldn't come. The noise in my head, the unease in my chest, kept me from focusing. I shut my laptop with a snap, deciding to get up and stretch my legs. The air felt thick, even inside, like I couldn't catch my breath, even though I wasn't doing anything strenuous. I walked to the back door, half expecting to see something outside, but there was nothing. The storm had picked up again, the rain hammering against the windows, the trees bending under the weight of the wind. It was nearly impossible to see anything through the fogged-up glass, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt someone was out there. The wind howled again, rattling the door and making the house creak under the pressure. I was about to turn away when I saw it. A shadow moving just beyond the edge of the porch, right outside the door. I froze. The figure was tall, obscured by the downpour, but I could make out enough to see that it was a person. Or at least it looked like one. I couldn't see any details, no face, no features. Just a shape that moved steadily and purposefully toward the door. I stepped back, heart pounding. I should have locked the door when I arrived, but I hadn't. Now, it felt like the worst decision I could have made. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, staring at the door. The figure, whoever it was, had stopped just outside the threshold, hidden in the rain. I didn't dare open the door to confront them. If it was someone in trouble, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But if it was someone who meant harm, I didn't want them to know I was here. A knot formed in my stomach, and I realized with sudden clarity that I wasn't alone in this cabin. Not anymore. I glanced around the room, the silence pressing down on me. The shadows of the furniture seemed to stretch, growing longer in the dim light. The fireplace flickered weakly, casting strange, distorted shapes on the walls. My hands trembled as I reached for the closest thing I could use for protection. A small kitchen knife I had grabbed earlier to cut some fruit. It wasn't much, but it was something. I stepped slowly back toward the window, my eyes never leaving the door. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to be prepared. The feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was lurking just beyond my sight, was overwhelming. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shadow disappeared. No footsteps. No movement. It was like the figure had never been there. I stood frozen in place for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Was it a trick of the light? A trick of my own mind? I wanted to believe that it was nothing, that I had imagined it, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The storm outside had begun to die down, the wind easing up, but the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. I sat back down on the couch, trying to calm my thoughts. But as I glanced toward the door once more, I realized something that chilled me to my core. The door was now slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it. There was no way I had. I never thought a weekend getaway to a secluded cabin would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. It was meant to be a quiet break, some time to disconnect, escape the noise of everyday life, and enjoy a bit of solitude in nature. I'd found this cabin on a small, obscure listing site. The photos showed a rustic wooden house nestled between towering trees, its charm enhanced by the distant mountains. It seemed perfect for some peace and quiet, especially after the chaos at work. The drive there was long, the kind of winding, narrow road that takes you through forests and past small, quiet towns. The farther I went, the more I felt like I was leaving the world behind. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The cabin itself was exactly what I had imagined. A cozy, two-story structure with a stone fireplace and large windows that overlooked the woods. It was the sort of place that made you think of warm blankets, a crackling fire, and maybe a good book. I had the place to myself, and that's exactly how I liked it. After settling in and unpacking, I decided to explore a little. The area was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The woods stretched out in every direction, thick and silent. The path leading to a small creek was overgrown with brush, but I could hear the soft rush of water in the distance. I followed the path, taking in the smells of fresh pine and damp earth. Everything about the place seemed perfect at first, but that evening, as darkness settled in, I began to notice things that weren't quite right. The first sign of trouble came as I was finishing dinner. I had made myself a simple meal, nothing fancy. As I sat down at the table, a loud thump echoed from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something larger in the woods. But it wasn't the usual sound. It was too loud, too deliberate. It made my stomach turn, and my instincts screamed that it wasn't right. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind or some wild animal wandering too close. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and I curled up on the couch, trying to relax. But that thump lingered in my mind, making the air feel heavy and the shadows in the corners of the room seem darker. An hour later, I heard it again. Another thump, closer this time. I stood up from the couch, my pulse quickening. I moved to the window and peered outside, but all I could see were the thick trees, their branches swaying in the wind. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing small sounds, scratches, scuffles, and those same thumping noises. At one point, I even thought I saw a shadow pass by one of the windows, though when I rushed to look, there was nothing there. The night felt endless, the weight of silence pressing down on me until I finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted but unsettled. The next morning, I woke up with the sun, feeling groggy and disoriented. I told myself that the previous night's events were just the result of stress, or maybe my imagination getting the best of me. I decided to take a walk and clear my head, hoping that being out in the fresh air would help. The forest was beautiful in the morning light, the air crisp and cool. But as I walked further, I noticed something strange. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, and odd marks on the ground. It looked like someone or something had passed through. The path I had walked the day before was still there, but now it felt different, more like an intrusion than a natural part of the forest. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just animals or weather, but as I continued walking, I began to feel like I was being watched. I stopped, scanning the woods around me. The trees were thick, and the underbrush was dense, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something wasn't right. I turned around and started heading back to the cabin. That afternoon, I stayed inside, reading and trying to distract myself from the growing sense of paranoia, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the cabin, felt amplified. I tried to make sense of it. Was it the isolation? Was I just overthinking everything? Or was something truly out there? By dusk, I was on edge. I decided to leave the cabin and go into town to grab some supplies. Maybe a change of scenery would do me good. The drive was only about 15 minutes, but it felt longer. The narrow roads twisted and turned through the darkening woods, and the tiny town seemed to be stuck in time, with only a few lights flickering in the windows of the stores. I picked up some food and other essentials, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. As I drove back to the cabin, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the woods. It was hard to make out, just a silhouette in the growing darkness. I slowed down, but the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. My heart raced as I drove past, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. There was no one behind me. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I parked in front of the cabin, quickly grabbing my bags and rushing inside. I locked the door behind me, my mind spinning with thoughts of what I'd just seen. Was it a person or something else? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. That night, I decided to keep all the lights on, including the outdoor ones. I figured if anyone or anything was out there, they wouldn't want to be seen. But despite my efforts to keep calm, I felt the weight of every sound, every creak of the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. Soft, measured steps, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, I heard a loud bang on the window. I froze. The flashlight dropped from my hand as I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. There was nothing outside when I peered through the glass, but I could still hear the sound of footsteps moving away. The rest of the night passed in an agonizing blur. Every minute felt like an hour, and every sound made my heart race. I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. My mind kept running through every possibility, every scenario, but none of them made sense. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. The next morning, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept a wink, and my nerves were frayed. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my things, my hands shaking as I hastily stuffed clothes and belongings into my bag. But as I opened the door to leave, I froze. There, at the base of the steps, was something that made my blood run cold. A series of footprints in the snow, leading from the woods directly to the cabin. They were fresh, too fresh, and they were large, almost impossibly large. I slammed the door shut, locking it again. My mind raced. The thumping noises, the figure in the woods, the footsteps. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was someone out there. But the question was, who and why? What did they want with me? I didn't wait around to find out. I grabbed my phone, but there was no service. My stomach twisted with panic. The only option was to leave. I grabbed the car keys, and as I opened the door one last time, I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, watching me. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning with the effort, until I reached the car and sped off down the winding road, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a place to stay. I didn't even care about my belongings left behind in the cabin. The fear was still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing there, watching me. I told the authorities about what happened, but they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone. They told me I was probably just imagining things, that the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. The terror I experienced wasn't a product of my mind. It was real, and to this day, I can't help but wonder, who or what was out there in the woods? What did they want? And why haven't I been back since? I had always dreamed of spending a weekend in the woods, alone, to clear my mind. Maybe it was the stress of my job or the constant noise of city life. Whatever the reason, I thought that renting a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere would be the perfect escape. Little did I know, that decision would change the course of my life. I found the cabin online, tucked away on a small, remote property at the foot of a mountain. The pictures were charming, rustic yet comfortable. It was everything I thought I wanted. Quiet, peaceful, and removed from civilization. The booking was simple, and a few days later, I packed up my car with supplies and headed out early in the morning. The drive was long, but the landscape was beautiful. Rolling hills, vast fields, and forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. As I made my way deeper into the woods, the air grew thicker with the scent of pine and damp earth. There was no one else on the road, no other cars in sight. I felt a strange sense of freedom, but as I got closer to the cabin, an unsettling feeling started to creep in. The road narrowed, and the trees grew taller, blocking out the sun. It felt like I was entering a different world, one that was far removed from anything familiar. When I finally arrived at the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how remote it was. There was no sign of life anywhere. No neighbors, no other buildings. Just trees, dirt roads, and the cabin standing alone in the middle of the woods. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air inside was cool and musty, like it hadn't been lived in for a while. The furniture was old but functional, and the kitchen was stocked with enough essentials to get me through the weekend. I was alone, in a place far from anyone, and the silence was both calming and eerie. I tried to shake off the nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite place. It was nothing, just the quiet surroundings, right? That first night, the darkness came quickly. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the air grew colder. I sat by the fireplace, reading a book to pass the time. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. I thought I heard a few twigs snap in the distance, but I dismissed it as nothing more than an animal, maybe a deer or something small. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The cabin was old, and the floorboards creaked with every step. As I made my way to the bedroom, I noticed something strange. The window above the bed was slightly open. I was certain I had closed it earlier, but now it was cracked, just enough to let in the cold air. I thought it was strange, but didn't think too much of it. After all, the cabin was old, and maybe the window just didn't close properly. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, trying to ignore the chill creeping in from the window. My eyes began to close, but then I heard it. Something outside. A sound. A rustling like footsteps. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox. But the sound persisted, moving closer, then stopping. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I strained to hear. There was nothing. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the silence. After a long while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Probably just the wind or some creature moving around in the woods. I finally drifted off to sleep, but it wasn't a peaceful rest. The sound of footsteps lingered in my dreams, always just out of reach. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling uneasy. The cabin felt colder than it should have, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood. I decided to go outside for a walk to clear my head. Maybe some fresh air would do me good. As I stepped onto the porch, I froze. There, in the dirt near the front steps, were tracks, fresh, deep prints in the mud, like someone had been standing there, looking at the cabin. My heart raced. There was no way they could be animal tracks. They were too large, too defined. And the strange thing was, they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Who could have been out here? The nearest town was miles away. There was no one around for miles. I looked around, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. The woods felt alive, and I was suddenly very aware of how isolated I was. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was someone else who had been out here, another camper, a hiker, maybe someone passing through. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the day inside, the strange tracks lingering in my mind. I told myself I was just overreacting, but my instincts told me otherwise. That night, I locked all the doors and checked the windows again. I even pulled the furniture in front of the door, something I would never normally do. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the fear that I wasn't alone. The silence outside was almost suffocating. The only sound was the wind, but even that felt unnatural, like it was moving differently. There was a chill in the air that made it feel as though the trees themselves were watching me. I was wide awake, my mind racing. Hours passed, and then, just as I thought I could finally drift to sleep, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were unmistakable. They were outside, slow, deliberate steps moving closer to the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. They stopped just outside the door. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. The sound of the footsteps lingered for what felt like an eternity. I waited, but there was nothing, just silence. My breathing was loud in the quiet room, and my skin prickled with fear. Slowly, I pulled the blankets tighter around me, praying whatever was outside would leave. The rest of the night passed in torturous silence, and when morning came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I grabbed my things and quickly packed up to leave. I didn't even bother to check outside again, knowing that I had to get away from that place. It didn't feel like home, it felt like a trap. As I loaded my car, I noticed something. There, on the side of the cabin, was a small mark. A scratch, long and deep, like something had clawed at the wood. My stomach churned. I didn't want to know what had caused it. I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. I drove out of the woods, my hands gripping the wheel, my eyes scanning the trees on either side of the road. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I reached the main highway, and even then, I couldn't shake the fear. The strange marks, the footsteps, the sense of being stalked. It all felt too real to be a coincidence. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself it was just a bad experience, a combination of the isolation and the overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew something was out there, watching. The truth is, I don't think it was just my imagination. Whatever it was, it wasn't human. And as much as I want to forget, I can't help but feel like it's still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be just a normal weekend camping trip, a chance to escape from the hustle of daily life, get away from my phone, and just be in nature. I had always loved the outdoors, the smell of pine trees, the sound of the wind rustling through leaves, and the crisp, cool air in the morning. I've done plenty of camping trips before, so I didn't expect anything strange. But something felt off this time, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The first sign that something was wrong came when we arrived at the campsite. The sun was still high in the sky, but the area had an eerie, unnatural stillness. It wasn't exactly the kind of silence you get when everything is peaceful. It was more like a dead quiet that hung in the air. It made me uncomfortable, but I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. We set up our tents near a small creek, just far enough from the trail so that we wouldn't be disturbed. There were only a few other campers in the area, scattered around the perimeter, but they were all keeping to themselves, and the sound of water flowing over rocks was soothing. I kept telling myself it was going to be a great trip. We had our gear ready, a few days of food packed, and I was looking forward to a peaceful night under the stars. As the evening approached, I built a fire and we sat around it talking about random stuff. How much we missed our regular lives, what we thought about the world, and how the stars were always a little brighter out here. It was all very typical for a camping trip, but that feeling I had earlier, that something wasn't quite right, kept nagging at me. The stillness in the air hadn't let up. The wind didn't pick up. The usual sounds of insects and distant animal calls were strangely absent. We ate dinner, roasted marshmallows, and drank a little. Eventually, we all decided to turn in early, since the next day was going to be a long hike. My friends, who were with me, settled into their tents, and I laid down in mine, trying to shake off that uneasy feeling. It didn't work. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours. Couldn't sleep. The only sounds I could hear were the quiet crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle in the brush. But it wasn't the usual sounds of animals or wind. It was different, like someone was moving around the camp, just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the odd sensation that someone, or something, was out there. Around midnight, I finally gave up on sleep. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the cool night air. The fire was still burning low, casting long shadows across the campsite. I decided to walk down to the creek to clear my head. The sound of the water was calming, but it couldn't shake the odd feeling that something wasn't right. I stood at the water's edge, staring into the darkness, trying to find something, anything, that would make me feel more grounded. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate footstep behind me. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. I didn't turn around, though. I knew if I did, I would see something I couldn't unsee. The steps were slow, almost like someone was walking carefully, trying not to make a sound. But the fact that they were so deliberate sent a chill down my spine. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my skin prickle with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I didn't dare move. I waited, and then, after what seemed like forever, the sound of footsteps stopped. But the air felt heavier now, more oppressive. I thought I heard a faint rustle of leaves, like something or someone was shifting in the shadows. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear. Felt like time had stretched into an eternity. But then, just as I was about to turn and sprint back to my tent, I heard something else, a faint voice, low and almost inaudible, as if someone was trying to whisper, but not quite succeeding. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was something that made my stomach churn. Something wrong, something unnatural. I didn't wait to hear more. I spun around and ran back to camp, my feet pounding on the ground, heart racing. I burst into my tent, zipped it up, and buried my head under the blanket, hoping to shut out the terror that was slowly creeping up my spine. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my friends what had happened, but they just laughed it off. They said I was probably just spooked by the darkness, that it was all in my head. They didn't seem to understand how real it had felt, but I couldn't shake that feeling that someone, or something, had been out there, watching me. We spent the day hiking, trying to put the strange night behind us. The forest was beautiful, the trees thick with moss and sunlight filtering through the canopy. It was the kind of place you would expect to feel safe, a place that should have made me forget the fear I felt last night. But it didn't. That nagging feeling followed me all day. Every time I heard a twig snap, I felt my pulse race. As the sun began to set again, I made a decision. I was going to stay awake tonight. I wasn't going to let whatever had been following me out there get any closer. We set up a larger fire, hoping the light would keep whatever it was away. But even as the fire blazed, I could feel my heart pounding harder and harder in my chest. Every crackle of the fire sounded like a threat. Every shift in the wind made me jump. It wasn't until late in the evening that I saw it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A shadow, tall and human-shaped, was standing at the edge of the camp, just outside the reach of the firelight. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there. I froze, my blood turning to ice. For a long moment, I thought I might be imagining it, but then the figure took a single step forward. Slowly, deliberately, I screamed, waking everyone up. We all scrambled out of our tents, and the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. We checked the area, but found nothing. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been there at all. That was it. I knew I couldn't stay there another minute. We packed up quickly, all of us nervous and shaken, and left the campsite in the middle of the night. We didn't look back, not once. It wasn't until we were miles away, safely back at the car, that we finally started to breathe again. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, still following us, even though we were leaving the woods behind. Looking back now, I don't know what it was. Was it a person? Some sort of predator? Or was it just the wild, playing tricks on me? I may never know, but I've never gone camping again. And every time I hear a twig snap behind me, I still remember that night, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of being hunted. I don't know what was out there, but I do know one thing: I never want to find out again. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace and quiet, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of life and enjoy the simple pleasures of the wilderness. I had planned the trip for weeks, packing only the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few other camping tools. I'd done this kind of thing before, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a weekend escape. I was looking for something more: solitude, time to reflect, and a break from the noise of everyday life. I chose a remote spot in the forest, far from the nearest trail or campground. No one would be around for miles, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, surrounded by nothing but trees, wildlife, and the quiet hum of nature. The weather was perfect when I arrived. Clear skies, the air crisp but not cold, and a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. Everything was as it should be. Setting up camp was easy. I found a flat, dry spot near a small creek, just far enough from the water to avoid any risk of flooding. The tent went up without a hitch, and I unpacked my things, trying to make the space feel like home for the next 2 nights. There was something about being in the middle of nowhere that made even the smallest task feel satisfying. I gathered some firewood and built a fire just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks into the air. It was beautiful, peaceful, the perfect start to a solo camping trip. As the evening settled in, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned soup and bread. I listened to the sounds of the forest around me: the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional croak of a frog by the creek, and the distant call of a night bird. It was the kind of stillness I had been craving, and for a moment, I thought I might finally be able to let go of the stress that had been building up in my life. But then, something changed. At first, it was subtle, a slight shift in the air, a change in the pattern of sounds. I could no longer hear the familiar rustling of leaves or the distant frogs. Instead, there was an eerie silence, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. I paused, listening closely. Nothing. It was so quiet now that the sound of my own breathing felt too loud. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just my imagination. After all, I was out in the wild. Of course, things felt a little off sometimes. But then I heard it. A snap. A twig breaking somewhere deep in the woods. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was too loud, too deliberate. Someone or something was out there. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe another camper had decided to set up nearby, but that didn't make sense. I had deliberately chosen a remote location, far from any trails or other campgrounds. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't supposed to be. I sat there, staring into the fire, trying to calm my nerves. I reminded myself that animals made noises too, and maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon. But the more I listened, the more it became clear that the sound wasn't coming from an animal. It was too heavy, too purposeful. I heard the crunch of leaves underfoot, then another snap of a twig, closer this time. I stood up quickly, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. There was nothing, just the shadows of trees stretching out into the blackness. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the woods, but the beam barely reached beyond the edge of the campsite. The forest seemed to swallow up the light, leaving everything beyond it in inky blackness. Another snap. This time it was much closer, right at the edge of the clearing where I had set up camp. My pulse quickened. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. It wasn't a wild animal. It wasn't a fellow camper. The sound was too calculated, too deliberate, like someone was trying to move quietly to avoid detection. I grabbed the knife I had packed for protection and walked cautiously to the edge of the firelight. My hand trembled slightly as I shone the flashlight across the darkness, but all I could see were trees and the faint outline of the creek. There was nothing there. The wind picked up, and I could hear the trees creaking in the distance, their branches swaying. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The rational part of my brain told me that I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just a deer or a bear, something harmless. But the unease was still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. I decided to wait. I stayed close to the fire, listening intently, waiting for any sign of movement. The silence had returned, but now it felt different, unnatural, like something was lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Hours passed. The unease didn't go away. I stayed alert, my eyes darting back and forth, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Eventually, the quiet became unbearable. I was exhausted, but sleep didn't come. My mind kept racing, imagining every possible scenario. What if someone was out there watching me? What if I wasn't alone? Just as I started to drift off, the sound came again. This time, it was unmistakable. The crunch of leaves, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped to my feet, the beam of light sweeping through the trees. There, just beyond the edge of the campsite, a figure stood. For a moment, I thought my heart had stopped. The figure was tall, its shape barely visible in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, just a silhouette against the night sky. I froze, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? Should I run? Before I could make a move, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I imagined it? Was I just seeing things? I wasn't sure, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my backpack, not bothering to fold the tent or pack things neatly. My hands were shaking, my mind too clouded with fear to focus. I decided to leave. The thought of staying another minute in that forest, alone, was unbearable. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled through the woods, trying to follow the trail I had taken earlier. But my mind was in a haze, and the path I had walked in during the day seemed completely different in the dark. Every sound made me jump. Every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't stop until I reached the car, almost an hour later. I threw everything in the back seat, slammed the door, and drove away without looking back. My mind was spinning, but at least I was safe. When I finally got back to the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station to collect myself. I didn't know if it had all been in my head, if the whole thing had been a product of my overactive imagination, or if something more sinister had been at play. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going back to that forest. I never found out who or what was out there that night. I never learned what was stalking me through the woods. But I do know this, I was lucky to get out of there when I did. Some questions are better left unanswered.